When I saw not a puppy but a wolf pup in Granny's arms, my breath caught, because I understood this was not an accident. I live next door to her. Everyone on our road calls her Granny, though she isn't my grandmother. She is small, with hands that remember bread dough and winter wood, and that day those same hands cupped a fur bundle like it was a found star. She had set a little cardboard box on the porch and lined it with an old flannel shirt. The pup fit there too well. He whined, that thin, pleading sound that makes you reach without thinking, and pressed his nose into the seam of her coat like the world could be mended by warmth alone. It looked so ordinary, my mind reached for the simple story. Someone dumped a puppy, Granny took him in, we tell a kind tale about it at church. Then he lifted his head and looked at me. Dogs blink, dogs glance and wag. This one did none of that. His eyes were a deep amber, glassy but alive, not soft, not tame. They pinned me where I stood. I felt seen in a way that made me step back. The ears were too tall, the paws too heavy for the rest of him, the legs long, the muzzle narrow. The smell was different too, not sweet like puppy breath, but cool and wild, like damp leaves and iron. "He's freezing," Granny said. "Poor baby," and there was such a plea in her voice that my own throat stung. I took the box inside. The room warmed around us. She warmed milk, broke it with a little honey, the way her mother taught her for orphaned kittens decades ago. I held the saucer to the pup. He didn't rush it. He looked at me first, the way a person checks a face before taking a gift, and then he drank, slow and steady, never spilling, never blinking. When he finished, he nosed my palm, not licking, just pressing once like a seal. I told her what I thought it was. I used the word out loud, wolf. The room felt smaller after it left my mouth. She shook her head with a tiny smile that had both defiance and tenderness. "A baby is a baby," she said. "He needs help." He fell asleep with his chin across the edge of the box, eyes half open, watching even in dreams. Each time Granny shifted in her chair, he opened them fully and tracked her. When she stood, he pushed his small body upright and followed with his gaze, not with clumsy puppy scrambling, but with quiet calculation, as if he measured the distance between her and the door. When she sighed and put a blanket over her knees, he made a sound I'd never heard from a dog, a breathy, almost hum, settled at her feet, and went still like a guard. I kept noticing things I had no place for. He never wagged. His tail hung and twitched once, a metronome of decision. He didn't mouth fingers or laces. He scanned, like a lighthouse light sweeping. When I moved toward Granny, he watched my hips, not my hands. When the wind pushed against the window, the hair along his back rose and fell as if the wind had entered him. At dusk, I took him outside to let him pee. He didn't lift his leg or circle like a pup. He nosed the air, head high, and then drew a line straight across the yard to the fence where the woods begin. He planted his small paws in the dirt and marked one time, deliberate. The sound of it felt like an announcement. He stood there, listening with his whole body. Something in the trees listened back. The quiet grew thick. "Come on, little one," I said, trying to make my voice light. He turned, met my eyes again, and for a heartbeat, I had the strangest sensation he was counting me, counting her, counting doors and dark places and the path back to the porch. He came when I called, not with puppy joy, but with a decision that felt heavy. We set up a basket by Granny's chair. He refused it. He walked to the threshold between the kitchen and the hall and folded himself there with a sigh, head toward the front door, body across the passage like a beam. Every time Granny coughed, he lifted his head. Every time the house settled, he raised one ear. When she laughed softly at an old show on the tiny television, he relaxed, but only by degrees. If a shadow passed on the porch, he rose, silent, no growl, just height, a line of focus. He made me feel both safe and afraid. I told myself it would be simple. We would call someone in the morning, a shelter, a rescue. I have a friend who knows people at the wildlife center over the ridge. We would hand him over. He would be cared for, taught to be wild, released. A story with a right edge to it. I even said it out loud to settle my own nerves. First thing tomorrow. Granny looked at me, and her eyes did the pleading this time. Let him have one night, she said. Just one. Look how he's looking at me. I looked. He had his chin on her slipper. He was not asleep. He was not begging. He was simply there with her, like a thought she couldn't shake. When I stepped closer, he shifted his gaze to me, and there was something there I have no word for. Not threat, not love. It was recognition without softness, and it pushed a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the February draft under the door. He looked at me like I belonged to him. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of that, but I didn't laugh. I couldn't. I made tea and watched the clock and tried not to watch him. He watched the door. In the late evening quiet, a siren wailed somewhere on the highway, far off. He tipped his head and made a sound like a question, not a howl, a thin, high note that stopped fast, as if he tugged it back into his chest. I felt it in my ribs. Granny reached down and stroked between his ears. He closed his eyes once and opened them again on her face, and I swear I saw him file it away like a map he might need. It should have been easy to be sensible. It should have been easy to pick up the phone and hand this mystery to experts. But when I reached for the receiver, the pup lifted his head and set his eyes on me, and the phone felt like a betrayal. I set it down. He lowered his head, satisfied, as if we had just agreed on something important. I tell myself now that the strange part began later, that the real story had not yet started, that this was only a soft opening, an old woman, a neighbor, a foundling in a box. I told myself she would feed him tonight. We would make calls tomorrow. He would go to the right people, and that would be that. I was sure she would raise him a little, and he would drift back to the trees when he was strong. I thought the story would close on a gentle goodbye. I thought that was all it would be. But nature was already writing another ending, and I had no idea. He grew in quiet leaps, like the way dawn moves across a floor. One morning his paws were only a little too big, and then, after a handful of dawns, they were almost comical. Yet he never crashed through the house like a puppy. He moved as if he had been told long ago to be careful with the world. He learned the rooms by scent, the creak of each board, the places where Granny's knees hurt, and the chair that sighed when she sat. He never chewed a shoe. He never snatched food. He waited, watching, as if manners had been stitched into his fur. We tried simple words because that is what you do. Sit, wait, easy. He didn't perform them. He accepted them. When Granny's hands trembled with the kettle, he settled without a word. When she muttered that her ankles burned, he eased himself across her feet and lay heavy and warm like a blanket that knew where the ache lived. I had seen therapy dogs on television. This felt different. He didn't seek praise. He listened for need and met it, like need was a sound only he could hear. There was a day I cannot forget. The light was thin, and Granny had a spell where her breath came short. He stood in front of her and lifted his face. He did not lick or paw. He only looked, and I saw it happen. The change in his gaze as it fixed on her like a star fixes on the night that holds it. He looked at her as if she were his mother. The room went so quiet, I heard the clock stall between ticks. She covered his head with both palms and whispered, "I am here." The old dog I grew up with would wag and whine for the words. This one received them like a vow and went still, eyes soft for the first time. That look cracked something in me. He looked at me like his own. He found his jobs without being told. In the morning he walked the fence, nose high, every step deliberate. No chasing birds, no barking at cars. At the back corner by the wild apple he always paused, leaning forward into the scent of the woods, counting. I kept thinking, though I had no proof. If a stranger passed on the road, he did not rush the gate. He stood beside Granny, as if the gate had moved to wherever she was. When the mail truck rattled up, he took one step forward and then one step back, placing himself so that any path to her would cross his shoulder first. It was not a threat, it was geometry, and she was the fixed point. He ate only after she ate. It became a rule he wrote himself. I would set the bowl down, and he would sit and wait while she took her slow bites of stew or a slice of bread with butter. Only when she sighed and wiped her mouth would he lower his head and begin. If her appetite was poor, his was too. I hated it and loved it at the same time. It felt like devotion, and it scared me, because devotion is heavy. He almost never made noise, a low breath when wind pushed at the eaves, a single huff when a squirrel scolded him from the woodpile, silence when a dog barked down the road as if he refused to join a language that wasn't his. But then came the night that turned a key I didn't know was in the door. It was late. The house was the soft kind of dark that happens after a long day of small chores. I had dozed in the chair. Granny slept in her bed, a light blanket over her shoulders even though the air still held a chill. A sound cut the quiet like a stitch popping. Not a howl, not even a whine. A tight, urgent keening pressed small to hold itself inside the walls. He was at the front door, front paws on the wood, pressing, letting go, pressing again, not to escape, but to speak. He threw one look back down the hall toward Granny's room, and then at me, hard, and then at the door again. The message was so clear, I felt my chest answer before my brain did. Come. Now I sat up, heart tripping, and then I told myself a softer story. He needs to go out. That's all. I reached for the latch. He didn't bolt. He slipped through and turned not to the yard but to Granny's window, the one that faced the side path. He stood there, head low, drawing the air in and letting it out in short huffs, paws planting and lifting, planting and lifting. He did not bark. He did not move toward the woods. He watched the dark path like the path itself might twitch. I said his name, gentle, and he came back, touched his nose to my leg, then back to the door, asking again. I followed. He led me along the porch boards, every muscle on a wire. At the corner, he stopped dead and leaned out, shoulders tight. The night made a noise then, a soft brush, and I saw it, the shape of someone or something slipping away along the fence line, low and fast. My mouth went dry. I did not see a face. I saw the space the face left behind. He did not give chase. He did something stranger. He backed up and placed his body full across the threshold and held it, as if to say, no one comes in and no one comes out. Not until I say so. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to bang the railing and call out and prove it was nothing. He looked at me, and the look stopped me like a hand on my chest. It was not fear in his eyes. It was decision. He shifted once, just enough that if Granny needed to come to the door, he would not block her, and then he went still again. We stood like that a long minute that felt like a held breath, the night thin as paper around us. When the wind turned, I smelled it too, a sour, unfamiliar mix that didn't belong to fox or dog or the old Tom that prowled the woodpile. My scalp prickled. He stayed at his post until the smell was gone, until the path felt empty even to me, and then he touched his nose to the door, asking to be let in. He went straight down the hall and lay with his chin across the crack under Granny's door. He slept, still watching. I told myself in the morning it was nothing more than animal sense, a raccoon, a stray, some restless night thing. I told myself he needed to run and worry and make a fuss the way young animals do. I thought it was just ordinary animal behavior, but I was wrong. The talk started as a ripple and turned into a tide. "That's a wolf," the neighbors said over fences and in the aisle at the little store. "He's dangerous." They spoke like they cared for Granny, but fear loves to dress as concern. I told myself it would blow over, that people always talk and then forget. I thought that would be the end of it. But the end wasn't anywhere near us. They began watching our yard the way folks watch a dark cloud, waiting for lightning. A man down the road said he might call someone official. Another warned me, chin lifted, that wolves can turn without warning. I almost believed them when I saw our wolf lay his head on Granny's knee and not blink. How could anyone be safe with a wild thing that's steady and that's silent? And yet the room always felt safer when he was in it. Fear and trust kept switching places in my chest until I couldn't tell which was which. He seemed to understand the new attention. He didn't perform for it, and he didn't hide from it. He just adjusted. He spent more time in the shade of the porch where he could see the road and the back gate in the same glance. He would lie there like a drawn line, front paws crossed, eyes half-lidded until a footstep sounded wrong. Then his whole body would tilt, not forward and not back, just toward the sound. If I moved too quick toward Granny, he flowed between us as if he'd always been there, and then eased away when I stopped, apologizing with a single breath. The day it happened was a Tuesday that felt like any other. The light was thin. The mail had come early. A truck I didn't know pulled up and idled at the curb. The man who climbed out wore a rumpled jacket and carried a clipboard the way some men carry a badge. He smiled with his teeth, but not with his eyes. "Ma'am," he called from the walkway as he came up, "I'm here about your gas meter. There's a problem. Urgent." Granny pushed up from her chair, one hand on the doorframe. I stepped in front of her, which was my habit, but I didn't need to. The wolf rose without noise and placed himself in the space between her and the man, chest squared, ears forward, weight even. He didn't snarl, not at first. He simply stood so that the geometry changed again. The shortest line to Granny now passed through him. "Easy there," the man said, still smiling, still walking. He lifted the clipboard like a shield, and something in the move, too polished, too practiced, flipped a switch in the wolf. The sound he made came from far inside, a low roll that made the porch boards hum under my feet. It wasn't loud. It was certain. The man stopped. "I just need to check the meter," he said, but his voice had a seam in it now. He glanced past us toward the side of the house. Our gate was latched. He took another step anyway, as if he could walk the lie into truth if he kept moving. The wolf took the same number of steps forward. The growl didn't deepen. It tightened, like a cable drawn. The man saw the teeth then, not bared in a show, but visible because the lips had thinned into a line that meant business. "Sir," I said, "we didn't call anyone." He looked at me for the first time, and in that glance I saw the scheme. An old woman, a fake repair, a doorway, a wallet, a house to step inside. The wolf saw it too. He raised his head a fraction and set his front paws harder to the boards. Granny's hand touched the wolf's shoulder. She didn't pull him back. She didn't hide behind him. She stepped up beside him and slipped her old fingers into the fur at his neck, the way a person finds a railing in the dark. "He is my protector," she said, clear as a bell. I will never forget the man's face at those words. The smile fell right off. He looked from her to the wolf and back, and whatever story he was telling himself about easy marks and gentle dogs no longer fit. The clipboard wobbled a little in his grip. The wolf didn't lunge. He didn't need to. He exhaled one firm breath that said, "You will have to go through me, and you will not like what happens if you try." The man took a step back. I'll come another time," he said. He pivoted, too fast, and in his hurry, he caught his boot on the porch step and stumbled. The wolf's ears flicked, but he stood. The man made it to the truck and drove away with that urgent rattle people have when they are fleeing something they don't want to name. We stood there, the three of us, while the sound of the engine thinned. The wolf didn't chase. He watched the road until the air felt like itself again, then turned and pressed his forehead lightly into Granny's hip, once, like a bow. She bent and kissed the top of his head. My throat burned. I hadn't been scared while it was happening. I was scared now, with the slow kind of fear that comes when you realize what almost was. After, he made a long circuit of the yard, nose low, tracing the place where the man had stood, the path of his steps, the pause by the gate. He marked once beside the mailbox and once by the back fence, not with anger, with finality. He came back to the porch and sat facing the road, a sentry relieved of duty, but not of attention. The neighbors pretended not to stare. I pretended not to see them. All evening he stayed near Granny, but he was not soft with her the way he sometimes was, when his head turned tender and his body unstrung. He was tall. He was work. When a branch tapped the window, he was already looking at it. When the fridge clicked, he filed it away and ignored it. He ate late, after she had finished, and even then he paused halfway through the bowl to listen, as if making sure the quiet stayed quiet. That night, when the house settled and the talk around town settled with it, I let myself think maybe that was the moment he had been given to us for. Maybe that was his purpose, to stand one time in a doorway and keep a wrong story from being written. I thought his mission ended there, but no. He grew into himself the way a river finds its banks. The legs that once looked too long became sure. The paws grew broad and quiet. His coat darkened along the spine, silvered at the ribs, and when he stood in the doorway at dusk, he filled it. The neighbors did not say puppy anymore. They said wolf with their mouths tight. I told myself not to think about what wolves do when they are called by their own. I told myself it would be fine. I thought the leaving would be gentle when it came. I was wrong to think I knew the shape of it. At night, his voice found the hills. The first time he truly howled, it came up out of him slow, a thread that pulled the air with it until the house seemed to lift. It was not loud the way a siren is loud. It was deep. It moved through wood and bone. I felt it behind my eyes. Granny gripped the arms of her chair and then let them go, tears on her face before she knew they were coming. The sound faded, and the quiet after felt like a held breath that did not want to be let out. I feared the sound because I knew what it meant. It meant the world was calling him by his real name. It meant the fence and the porch and the small lamp by Granny's chair were not enough to keep him. He would go. He had to go. I pictured a morning with his prints leading away and no return print beside them. I tried not to look at the line where the yard gives to the trees, but at first light, every time, there he was, trotting in from the edge of the world as if he had only stepped out to check the weather. He would shake frost from his back, step inside, and put his head on Granny's knees like a question and an answer, both. She would lay both hands on him and cry without sound. I pretended not to see the tears. They were not only sorrow, they were too full for one name. "You are my son," she whispered into his thick fur. The words were small and impossible and true. He closed his eyes once, slow, and pressed closer. It felt like watching something that should not exist, and yet there it was in front of me, alive and warm and breathing. He divided his days between two worlds as if the seam between them had always been there waiting for him to walk. In the mornings, he was all house, slow, heavy warmth across Granny's feet, careful steps in the narrow kitchen, a breath on the back of her hand when she reached for the kettle. By noon, he walked the fence and checked each post, each gate, the way a farmer checks his fields. In late afternoon, he would stand at the edge of shade and look toward the timber. He did not whine to be let go. He stood and waited until Granny nodded, as if her permission gave him a thread to follow back. Then he slipped through the gate and vanished, his tail a last dark brush against grass. Sometimes, far off, an answer came to his night song. Not close, not crowding, just there, across the ridge, like a bell answered by another bell. He would lift his head and listen so hard, his whole body listened. I could see the pull take him. It scared me clean. One evening he stood at the threshold a long time, one paw lifted, not quite set down. He turned his head and looked at Granny. She looked back. "Go," she said, voice shaking. "Go and come home." He placed the paw and went. He came back at dawn with leaves in his coat and a wild apple clamped gentle in his teeth. He set it in her lap and sat. She laughed and cried at once, stroked his face, and ate the apple while he watched, content just to be near the sound of her chewing. There were nights when the voice in him would not be quiet. He would circle the house in the dark, slow, shadows flowing over his shoulders, then stop and throw his head back. The note started thin, grew round and full, and then broke clean, as if he did not want to wake her and could not help himself. I lay awake, counting the space between songs. It was never long. Fear came in waves, then morning came, and with it the soft weight of his head on her knees, and fear lost ground again. One storm pushed through with rain in sheets and wind that hammered the roof flat with its hand. I thought he would stay inside with us, tuck himself small under the table, be house and hearth for one night. He did not. When the first low thunder rolled, he went to the door and looked back over his shoulder, asking, and I opened. He stepped out into the rain and stood like a dark stake driven into the yard. He lifted his face and sang into the wind. And then, stranger than the storm, another shadow moved near the back line of the fence, a gray shape, then another, there and gone between lightning pulses. My mouth went dry. He did not run to them, and they did not come to him. He placed himself between the fence and our door and sang again, a short, hard note that sounded like a line drawn on a map. The shapes melted back into the trees. He shook the rain from his ears and came inside, water wringing off his coat in a fine mist. He went straight to Granny and pressed his forehead to her chest, right where her heartbeat lives, as if to check a reading only he could read. On a clear night after that, I watched him sit a long while at the end of the porch, looking into the dark the way a man looks at a road he knows he will take. I told myself, tomorrow he will not come back. I said it so many times it dulled the part of me that panic lives in. I even tried to be noble inside my own head, to be the kind of person who lets a wild heart go. Dawn came pale and ordinary. He trotted up the path like he had only stepped out for a breath. He set his head on her knees. She whispered the words. He stayed until the sun warmed the floorboards, and she fell asleep in the chair, then rose and walked to the threshold to wait for the nod. I was certain that one morning he would fail to appear, that the edge of the yard would hold only quiet and dew, and that would be the day I understood what goodbye really is. I was sure he would not return, but things went another way. He changed before my eyes in ways I couldn't name. The circles he used to make around the yard widened until they weren't circles anymore, but long, deliberate sweeps that reached every corner of fence and shadow. He paused more often with his nose tipped high, drawing the air in short counts, storing it the way a cautious man stores water. Some evenings, he wouldn't touch his food until he had walked those lines twice, sometimes 3 times, and only then would he stand over the bowl like a guard on break, eating with one ear always turned toward the trees. The old quiet had left him. A listening kind of quiet took its place. It began with small signs that didn't feel small. The birds around the apple stopped scolding and went still. The motion light flicked on with no wind to trip it. At the back corner where the fence meets the hedge, I found a snag of coarse fur the color of old rope and a smear in the dirt that said heavy bodies had slid there. He lowered his head to it, and the muscles along his shoulders rose and fell like a held breath. He looked at me then, and in his eyes was a worry so human it shook me. He knew something I did not. I wanted to believe it was nothing, At dusk, he took to standing on the porch step that looks down the side path and the gate, not lying, not even sitting, but tall, as if the step had turned into a watchtower. If a truck rattled past, he didn't twitch. If a neighbor called hello, he didn't answer with a glance. But if the air shifted, even a little, he turned his head and drew it in, slow, as if testing it against a memory. Once he walked to the crawlspace hatch and set his nose to the seam, then looked back at me, then at the seam again, asking and telling at the same time. I lifted the latch and shone a light. Nothing showed but dark and dust, yet his stare stayed hard on the hollow, as if it held a story I couldn't read. His voice changed too. The long song he saved for the hills thinned into smaller notes at the edges of the yard, not howls, warnings given to the night in syllables. He sent one up the fence line, one to the hedgerow, one to the corner by the shed, and then stood in the center like a compass needle, listening to what the ground said back. When Granny shifted in her chair, he went to her in 2 strides and set his chest against her knees, heavy and warm, then returned to his post. He was splitting himself between worlds and refusing to drop either. It was late when he made his first hard decision against her. The air had that sharp smell that means weather is changing even when the sky is clear. Granny reached for the door to step out and tapped the barometer with her knuckle, an old habit, more ritual than need. He moved so fast I didn't see the step, I only saw the result. His body took the doorway. He pressed his shoulder, not rough, but firm, against her thigh and eased her back from the threshold. She tried to sidestep, and he mirrored her, blocking, then looked up into her face with those eyes so full of worry that my own knees weakened. He didn't growl. He simply would not let her pass. "Sweetheart," she said, half laughing, "I'm only going to the stoop." She set her palm to his head to move him the way you move a gentle dog. He didn't budge. He placed one paw over the strip of light that fell from the door, like laying a hand over a candle. When she tried again, he lifted his muzzle and touched her elbow with it, a soft push that carried more command than any bark. I stood there with the door open, feeling the cold carry a smell I could not name, faint, sour, wrong. He knew it clear as a bell. He slid his body sideways, and the door closed under his weight with a click that sounded final. After that night, his patrol sharpened. He started drawing Z-shapes through the yard, cutting each path he'd just walked, sampling old air and new, as if measuring the change. He marked rarely, but when he did, it was at the same 2 points, the mailbox post and the far corner by the hedge. He slept across the hallway with his nose below the crack of Granny's bedroom door and the rest of him angled toward the front, a living brace. When she coughed, he lifted his head. When the house sighed, he counted the sound and let it go. We began finding signs we couldn't ignore. The trash can behind the shed had a dent too wide for a raccoon. A low branch near the gate wore fresh gouges that curved like fingers instead of claws. In the morning, prints showed soft in the mud beyond the fence, pad marks layered over boot treads, both old, both blurred by dew. I told myself it could be anything. I told myself the woods were busy and we were making stories out of shadows. But each time I reached for a plain answer, he would look up from his post with that same steady worry, and the plain answer fell apart in my hands. One evening, he lifted his head from Granny's lap and went still, not listening, not scenting, just still, the way a deer freezes when the world changes by a hair. He stepped to the window and watched the far dark beyond our light. I followed his gaze and saw nothing. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe for a count. Then he turned and touched her wrist with his nose, once, like a warning wrapped in comfort. She stroked his cheek, and I saw tears standing in her eyes before she knew they were there. "All right," she whispered, to him or to whatever he'd heard. "All right." We talked ourselves calm the way people do. We said maybe a boar had started ranging down the draw. Maybe stray dogs were testing the fences now that winter had thinned the easy meals. Maybe it was a bobcat. He was young, we said, even if he wore the weight of an old animal. Young ones spook, young ones make a fuss. We decided he was only catching the scent of game in the timber, nothing more. But it was a warning. The trouble finally showed itself with weight. The ground beyond the fence was ripped like a plow had passed in the night. The trash can behind the shed lay on its side with muddy tusk marks pressed into the metal. Down by the hedgerow, earth was churned to dark soup, and the grass lay slicked flat in lanes, not tracks, lanes like something heavy had pushed through without caring what it broke. The air carried that sour, hot smell we'd been tasting at the back of our throats for days. He lifted it in short counts and filed it away. I pretended not to know what it meant. A bore, I said to myself, or worse. That evening he would not settle. He drew those Z-shaped patrols until the dirt took the map of his steps. He marked at the mailbox, then at the far corner, then came to Granny, laid his head on her knees, and didn't close his eyes. He kept them on the door. When the light thinned and the woods went from green to black, he stood and put his body at the threshold. He looked at her, then at me, then out, asking and telling at the same time. I shook my head because fear made me stingy. He held my gaze until I looked away. Then the night made a sound like a log splitting, one solid crack, and the air turned alive with brush noise. He made his choice. He slipped through the crack of the door with that quick, silent speed he saved for work, not for play. I went after him, but the dark swallowed him whole and gave me only sound. A heavy rush, a deep grunt that rolled the fence, the sharp tear of brush, and then his voice. Not a song, not a warning, but a short, hard bark that meant here. Granny's hand clutched my arm so tight I felt her bones. "Come back," she whispered to a night that did not care what we wanted. I wanted to follow. I took 2 steps off the porch, and the ground under my shoes felt like a slick lie. I saw, in the lightning of my own fear, the slab of a boar's shoulder, the glint of a tusk, the spill of a wild thing that does not think, only breaks. I called his name once, too loud, too human, and the brush answered with a violent shove, and then nothing. Silence sat down on us. I stood there shaking, counting heartbeats, hating myself for counting. The night answered with a low moan of wind, as if it had swallowed everything and was done. It was long minutes before I saw him. He came out of the edge of dark, like a piece of the dark, decided to move. He was low in the front, high in the back, the careful crawl a hurt animal makes when pride will not let it stagger. The right shoulder was wet. In the porch light, the wet showed itself for what it was. He stopped at the foot of the step and lifted his eyes to us. I reached for him. He stepped sideways, quick as a thought, not away from me, but away from Granny. He put his body between her and his own blood. "Baby," she breathed, and tried to kneel. He moved again, blocking, gentle and firm the way he had barred her from the door that other night. He would not let her hands touch the red. He would not let it touch her. He looked at me then, hard, and I understood. He was asking me to be the one to carry the mess. I grabbed towels. I grabbed the old basin. I was clumsy with fear and shame. He stood for me, shaking, and let me press cloth to the slash that cut clean across the meat of his shoulder, a tusk's work, if I've ever seen one. Each time Granny's hand hovered near, he edged forward so the wound stayed out of her reach and out of her sight. He was bleeding and he was protecting in the same breath. He would not come inside, not one paw. He set himself on the top step, chest to the yard, his back end against the jamb, so he could both face the dark and block the door. I worked on him there with warm water and clean towels and words that were too small. He bore it in a silence that hurt worse than any cry. When I pressed too hard, he set his teeth, not on me, but into the towel, and held. When the bleeding slowed, he licked my wrist once, quick, like a thank you he didn't have time for. He wouldn't drink until Granny took a sip from the cup. Even hurt, his rule held. All night he held that post. If I moved, he flicked an ear. If the house popped, he filed it away and ignored it. If the wind brought that sour note, he lifted his head, a low sound in his chest, like a wire drawn tight. In the far hours I dozed in the doorway, with my back against the frame, and woke to find his nose pressed to the crack under Granny's door again, the rest of him angled outward, a living brace, a sluice to keep anything bad from reaching her. My chest hurt from how much I loved him, and how much I was afraid for him. At first light, I expected him to be gone, to have taken his pain into the trees the way wild things do, to have chosen the woods over the smallness of our porch. I stood up to find him still there, front paws on the mat, shoulders square, eyes bright with fever and stubbornness both. He stood when Granny stirred, shook himself once, and set his body between her and the yard. He limped the fence line slow, checked the mailbox, checked the far corner, and marked. He was bleeding and he was still doing his work. The yard told the rest of the story in pieces, a great wedge dug out of the earth near the hedge, the sharp, skittered lines of hooves where the boar had cut and spun, a tuft of bristle stuck in the lower slats where the fence had bounced the beast back. I found the shape of his fight in the grass. No chase, no wild looping, only short, hard arcs where he had put himself in the way, driving the weight away from the porch, away from her window, away from the door. Granny cried when she saw the wound proper. He stepped sideways again, keeping the red behind him, and laid his head on her hip like a child asking forgiveness for a broken plate. "My son," she whispered and stroked his dry cheek, the one that smelled only of sun and dog and him. He leaned into that touch so soft I thought he'd fall. I thought he would give himself away to this fight and slip off to the trees to die alone, the way stories say wild things do. I thought his sacrifice had already been made, and what we had left was only waiting. But he did not leave. He was not done. He was waiting for the real moment, and it had not arrived yet. It happened on a night that felt like any other, and then it didn't. The house was quiet, the clock doing its small, brave ticks, and the wolf lay stretched across the hallway like a beam. I had just drifted when the sound came. His voice, but not his song. It wasn't the round note he saved for the hills. It was a torn sound, urgent and raw, as if he were trying to pull breath out of the air with his teeth. I was on my feet before I knew I'd moved. He was already moving, shoulders low, ears cut forward, eyes fixed down the hall. He touched his nose to Granny's door and then to my hand, hard, demanding, then spun and drove his shoulder into the front door so it knocked the chain. I opened it without thinking. He bolted into the night and then did the strangest, smartest thing I have ever seen an animal do. He did not run for the trees. He ran for people. He hit my door first, forepaws thundering against the wood, then tore across the lane to the next porch. He reared, struck the panels with both paws, and let out that ripped alarm that was not a howl and not a bark, but something made to break sleep. Lights flared. A voice shouted my name, frightened and angry both. He dropped, looked back over his shoulder to make sure we saw, and sprinted to the next house. Pause, slam, cry. Pause, slam, cry. He was ringing the night like a bell that had no handle. I ran after him barefoot, calling, and at each porch he waited just long enough to lock eyes, then launched for the next. Doors opened. Faces came into the light, stunned, ready to throw things, and then they saw me running, and the wolf turning, and they understood in a place deeper than sense that this was not about fear of him. This was about fear for someone else. "Something's wrong with her," I shouted, the words knotting in my throat. "With Granny." He spun and led, no wasted step, straight back to her gate. He didn't look to see if we followed. He knew we would. He shouldered the latch with a practiced shove and slid through, and when the first neighbor hesitated at the fence, he came back 2 steps, touched his nose to the man's hand like a tug, and returned to the door. I had the key out, hands shaking so hard I missed the lock twice. When it turned, he was already inside, already down the hall, already planted by her bed. The room was wrong from the first breath. The air had that flat taste rooms get when breath has gone shallow. She was half upright against her pillows, eyes open but far, one hand pressed to her chest, her lips an odd color I had never seen on her face. The wolf sat with his flank against the mattress, not on it, not crowding, just anchoring. He lifted his muzzle and looked at me with a plea so human my knees went loose. He was asking me to do the thing he could not do. "Call 911, the neighbor said behind me, voice hoarse, as if we shared one mind. I fumbled the phone, hit the numbers, said the words, old woman, chest pain, barely breathing, hurry. The wolf heard the tone of my voice and went stiller, as if he knew the wire in the air would carry help back along it, if only we held together long enough. Granny tried to speak and couldn't. She made a small sound that was all fight and not enough air. He leaned closer, not climbing, not pressing, but placing the weight of his head gently on the blanket over her thighs, exactly where he always put it in the mornings, as if to remind her body of the path back to breath. She reached for him, fingers shaking, and he shifted so the nearest part of him was the clean side of his face, the one that did not carry old blood, even now careful not to stain her with any part of him that had ever known hurt. There was a geometric miracle in the way he managed the room. He kept his body between her and the door, in case the world tried to take her, but he left a clean path at the foot of the bed for the people who could help. When the neighbors pressed in, he did not growl. He watched their hands, their feet, their eyes, and when one person reached too fast, he lifted his head just enough to slow them without a sound. He was not guarding her from us. He was guarding the shape of the help itself. The siren grew, small to large, then stopped sharp in the street. The paramedics came with their bright cases and their calm like a weather system. The wolf stepped back one pace and sat, not in the corner, not in the doorway, but in a place where he could see her face and their faces at once. He watched the oxygen mask. He watched the pulse clip. He watched the pressure cuff swell and fall. When they asked her name, he turned his head toward her mouth as if ready to answer if she could not. When they asked permission to lift her, he glanced at me and then at the medic's hands, and I heard myself say yes before my fear could say, wait. They worked fast, with quiet words. Color crept back into her lips like dawn. The lead medic glanced at me and nodded once, that deep nod that means barely in time. "If you hadn't called," he said. I looked at the wolf. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat like a man who has finished a long shift. Then he rose and walked beside the stretcher to the door, stopping there, understanding lines we never taught him, where his work ended and theirs began. On the porch, as they carried her to the ambulance, he lifted his face to the night and sent one short note into it. Not a song, not a cry, a mark, a line on a map. The neighbors stood with their hands to their throats. Someone was crying. Someone whispered a prayer. I put my hand on his shoulder and felt the tremor running through him like a wire singing down a pole after lightning. He leaned into my palm and then pulled away to watch the ambulance doors close. He saved her life. That is the plain truth threaded through the impossible parts. He woke a sleeping street. He gathered the ones who could act. He put them in the right place at the right time. And he held his watch until breath returned to the body that had called him son. I thought the story ended there, tied off neat. I thought we would say thank you to the sky and settle into a quiet meant for saints. But there was one more blow coming, and I did not see it until it was too late. The night after he saved her, the house felt opened and held at the same time. The bed smelled of oxygen and tape and the faint, sharp scent the medics leave behind. He took his place the way he always had, chin at the crack beneath her door, body angled toward the front, a living brace. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall and waited for sleep that did not come. Each time Granny shifted, he raised his head. When she dozed, he let his chest sink to the boards, but kept his eyes on the dark. Before dawn, I closed my eyes for the length of a breath. When I opened them, the space where he had lain was empty. The hallway held only the thin print of fur pressed in the dust and the silence that stays after a door has been opened and closed without sound. I called him once, quietly, and the house gave the call back to me. No answer, no tags to jingle, only that new quiet. We did not see him go. No one did. The first light showed the rest. On the porch, the mat wore 2 wet ovals where his paws had stood. From there, Prince walked a map he had walked 1,000 times. One set to the mailbox, a pause where he always paused, then back to the door. One set to the far corner by the hedge, a mark, then a long, straight line to the apple tree. A last set along the fence to the gap the deer use, the dirt there stamped once, hard, as if he had pressed goodbye into the ground. Beyond the fence, the tracks thinned and joined a deer trail, and then blurred where the leaf litter began. I followed until the prints became scuffs, and the scuffs became forest, and the forest became only forest again. Neighbors drifted into the yard, with their morning faces still soft with sleep. No one said wolf the way they used to. They said his name, low and careful, like it might break. One woman knelt at the hedge and touched the print as if it were warm. A man who had spoken loudest against him kept his cap in both hands and stared at the trees like they might speak if he waited long enough. They looked at me for answers I did not have. I looked at the empty doorway and felt something in my chest tilt. Granny was still at the hospital for tests, breathing better under the hiss of the green oxygen. I went to her with the news, and the words tangled because I wanted to be braver than I felt. "He's gone," I said, and then, softer, "We didn't see him leave." Her eyes filled before the rest of her face moved. The tears came slow, the kind that have to pass through years on their way out. She pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth and sobbed once, the way a child sobs when they are surprised by their own grief. Then she set her hand on her chest to quiet it, and said words that steadied me and undid me in the same breath. He did what he had to do. He was sent from above. I drove home and put his bowl on the porch anyway. Habit is a kind of prayer. I slid it close to the step where he liked to eat, with his shoulder against the jamb and his eyes on the yard. The food went untouched. By noon the birds had found it and then decided against it, as if even they understood this bowl did not belong to them. I left it there until evening and then brought it in, because leaving it out felt like asking too much of the night. I kept telling myself the plainest story, that he had gone to his own, to voices that matched the shape of his voice, to the old roads in the timber where paws lay one behind the other, and the wild makes a proper home. It made sense, and it didn't. He had walked this yard like it was a duty and a blessing both, and duties do not lift from a body all at once. I found new marks at the old places for 2 mornings after he left, light, fading, but there, at the mailbox post, at the hedge corner, a whisper of him laid over the wood. Maybe they were old and I was new to seeing them. Maybe he had come back in the deep hours when I slept and placed the quiet version of himself in the old places so the house would not lose its shape. Nobody saw. Only the marks spoke. The neighbors stopped by with casseroles meant for grief that had not decided what to call itself. A few said they had heard him in the night, not up in the ridge, but far down the draw, one clean note that did not linger. I wanted to believe that meant he was not far. I wanted to believe it meant he was, if not ours, then still within the same map. The man with the cap told me he had dreamed of a shadow at his fence, standing and listening. He swore he woke and saw nothing, and yet the grass the next morning was pressed where something had stood. We become superstitious when love does not know where to put its hands. When Granny came home, the house made a sound I had never heard it make, a kind of glad hush. She stopped in the doorway and put her palm flat to the jamb where his shoulder used to lean. She saw the empty bowl on the counter and put her fingers to it and then to her lips. In her chair, she folded a blanket over her knees with the slow patience of someone making a bed in a place they intend to stay. She did not ask me to call anyone to look for him. She did not whistle at the porch rail. She sat very still and let the tears come like rain in a light wind. "He looked at me like I was his own," she said. "And I know. He remembered kindness." The words put my own throat in a fist. That first night home, we left the porch light on like we had done 100 times for him. The yard stayed empty. A stray dog came as far as the road and turned away with hackles up, reading a line we could not see. At midnight, a wind moved through and carried a thin scent of wet earth and old leaves that made every hair on my arms lift. I stood at the steps with my hand on the rail and listened hard. A long minute passed. Somewhere far off, a single note rose, held, and ended clean, as if the singer did not want to wake anyone. I could not tell if it was his voice or only the shape of wanting to hear it. I thought that was the end of the story, the right kind of end. A wild heart does its work and goes, and the people who were kept safe carry the keeping forward in their bones. I thought everything had completed its circle. But then, months later, the house learned a softer kind of quiet. The bowl was in the cupboard. The blanket by the chair was folded and stayed folded. At night, the porch light burned out, and I did not replace it right away because leaving it dark hurt less than watching it glow for no one. Granny moved slower, but breathed deeper. She kept one hand on the door frame when she stood, the way a sailor keeps a palm on the mast, even when the sea is kind. I told myself this was how a story ends. The danger passes, the heart learns a new rhythm. The wild goes back to the wild. I tried to believe it. I almost did. But the world had one more thing to say. It was late summer by then, the kind where the grass is brittle at noon and sweet at dusk. The night was so still, the crickets sounded far away. I was washing a cup at the sink when I saw Granny freeze in her chair, her chin lifted as if a string had tugged it. "Do you hear?" she whispered, and I did not yet. I dried my hands and stood beside her, and then it came, thin at first, then rounder, then clean as water poured from a high place. A howl, but not the long song he gave to hills. This one held itself small, as if the singer did not want to wake the world, only one house on one road. My heart stuttered and then ran. Granny's fingers gripped the arm of the chair and then let go. She stood without her usual pause and walked to the door. I moved to help, and she lifted one trembling hand, and I understood. This was something she needed to do standing on her own feet. She turned the knob and breathed in. The air smelled of dry weeds and a hint of rain a long way off. The sound came again, closer now, a line drawn through the dark that ended at our porch. We stepped out. The yard was a flat wash of silver, the kind of light that makes every shadow look like a thought. At the edge where the yard gives to the trees, the world had gathered itself. I saw him before I knew I saw him, the shape first, then the fact of him, tall and still on the lip of the clearing. He did not move. He did not lower his head. He stood like a question asked and already answered. I could not breathe right. My hands went cold and hot in the same second. Granny made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. He did not come closer. He would not. He had always known lines we never taught him. He kept them even now. But he looked, and the look was the whole of it. He looked at her the way he had looked that first day when he placed his chin on her knees and accepted a world that made no sense. In his eyes was the same look a child has when he says goodbye to his mother. It hit me so hard my knees went weak. "Sweet boy," she said, and her voice was both broken and whole. She lifted her hand, palm out, the way she did when she told him go and come home. He did not step. He shifted the smallest part of himself, a weight change you could miss if you blinked, and the movement said, "I hear you." The wind did a small thing in the leaves, and the sound of it moved through him like a thought. He was not thinner. He was not fatter. He was exactly himself, only more so, the way faces get truer when you have not seen them for a long while, and then you do. I wanted to speak. My throat would not work. I wanted to run toward him and also to hold still so I would not spook the moment. My mind filled with every morning he had laid his head on her knees. Every evening he had stood at the threshold and waited for the nod. Every night he had placed his body where danger would have to pass. All of it was in the space between us now, his side of the world and ours, and none of it felt broken. It felt complete in a way that scared me. He lowered his head 1 inch and lifted it again. That was all. A bow not to us, but to the story we had shared. Granny pressed her hand to her chest. Tears slid down her cheeks and left bright tracks. "Thank you," she said, barely sound, only breath. "I swear to you," he heard. He closed his eyes once, slow, and when he opened them, they were deep and steady and old. For a passing moment, the night widened. I felt something like a door unlatched between worlds. I could not have stepped through it if you offered me the sky. I could only stand there and feel my own heart shaking, like it wanted to climb out of me and go lie at his feet. That is how strong the pull was. He held the line for me. He held the line for her. He always had. I thought then that he might break his rule, that he might cross the grass and come to lay his head on her knees one last time. The thought rose like a bird in my chest, beating its wings so hard it hurt. I took a breath to make room for it. He kept his distance. He saved us from the wish we could not have paid for. The keeping was in the not coming, and I did not understand that until later. He turned his head toward the ridge. The sound came again from far off, the faintest echo. Not an order, not a demand, only the world reminding him of his name. He looked back at us. Everything that had ever been between us lived in that glance. The night he blocked the door with his body, the morning he brought the apple and watched her eat it, the moment he woke the sleeping street and dragged help to her bed, the way he would not let his blood touch her hands. He had carried our lives like a bowl and never spilled. He stood a breath longer. Then he turned. Not with hurry, not with drama, only with a sure step that said the decision had been made a long time ago. He slid into the dark the way a river slides under a bridge. The last of him to go was the line of his back, then the soft lift of his tail, then nothing. The trees took him without a sound. We stood a long time after that. The crickets found their rhythm again. A breeze moved through the hedge and made a sound like paper being turned. Granny lowered her hand and wiped her face, and then leaned her shoulder to mine like a girl. My body trembled the way a struck bell trembles when the note is done. I had thought I knew how things worked. I did not. The good he did not belong to us. It belonged to the world that had sent him and then called him home when his work was finished. I went inside and sat on the floor and put my hands over my face. When I could speak, I spoke to the empty hallway that was not empty anymore, because everything we had seen now lived there. I say it now with the same shaking inside me. This cannot be, but I saw it myself. The wolf saved her life and left because he knew his mission was complete. If your heart is thudding and your hands feel cold, you understand. If you also believe in a special bond with animals, right, we are not alone in this world.